He held my journal up over his head like a fish he'd caught, turning it so the whole dinner table could see the foxglove I'd hand-stamped into the cover, and he grinned that grin he saved for whenever he was about to take a piece out of someone smaller than him. "Look at this, everybody," Brett said, loud enough for the executives at the next table to turn. "Naomi here moonlights. Little arts and crafts thing on the side. Candles, doilies, whatever this is." He flipped it open, made a show of squinting at the pages. "I keep telling her, when the hobby doesn't work out, the analyst chair is still warm." He set it down in a puddle of spilled wine. "Some of us are building careers. Some of us are gluing glitter." The table laughed. Not all of them, but enough. I reached over, slid the journal out of the wine, and dried the corner against my napkin without rushing. Then I looked at him, and I said the only thing I said the whole dinner. "You should be careful what you call small, Brett." He didn't hear it. He was already telling the candle joke again to someone who'd missed it. 40 minutes later, the woman from HR walked into that dining room with a single sheet of paper in a clear folder, scanned the tables until she found me, and said 6 words that made Brett Mason go gray in front of every executive he'd spent 3 years trying to impress. 6 words about my last name. The same last name that, until that moment, every person in that room had assumed was just a coincidence. Stay with me, because what happened in the next 90 minutes is the reason I'm telling you this story at all. Welcome back. I'm Naomi. I'm 34, and for almost 2 years, I sat in a gray cubicle in a regional logistics office and let an entire company believe I was nobody in particular. This is the story of the retreat where my boss decided to make me the evening's entertainment, and what he learned about the name on my paycheck the hard way. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who never once thought to ask who you actually were, do me a favor and leave a comment below. And if a quiet person has ever turned out to be the most important one in the room, you already know how this ends. Subscribe so you don't miss the moment it lands. Let me take you back. I didn't grow up rich, exactly, but I grew up around trucks. My grandfather, Walter, started a little freight outfit out of a 2-bay garage in 1961, hauling lumber and canned goods up and down the coast in a single second-hand rig with his own name painted on the door. Halloran. By the time my father took it over, that one truck had become 200, and a garage had become a company with terminals in 4 states. My dad, Daniel, was the kind of man who knew every driver's first name and every driver's kid's first name, and who believed, deep in his bones, that you had no business running a thing you didn't understand from the floor up. When I was 9, he took me to the central terminal on a Saturday and made me ride the whole loop in the cab of a delivery truck with a driver named Earl, who'd been there longer than I'd been alive. "You see how the company actually works," my dad told me that night. "By sitting where the work actually happens. Anybody can read a spreadsheet about it. Almost nobody bothers to feel it." I held on to that longer than he probably expected me to. In 2009, the company merged with a competitor, and the board decided the old name sounded too dusty, too small, too 1961. They rebranded. Halloran Freight became Cardinal Logistics, sleek, modern, a red bird on every trailer, instead of my grandfather's surname. My father hated it and signed off on it anyway, because that's what you do when you're trying to keep 3,000 people employed. The Halloran name came off the trucks. It stayed on the ownership documents, locked away in a family trust, where almost nobody ever looked. My father died 3 years ago. Heart, in his sleep, a Tuesday. He left me the trust, 58% of Cardinal Logistics, a controlling interest, held in my name, and managed, on paper, by a board and a hired CEO who ran the day-to-day. I was, technically, the most powerful person at a company, most of whose employees had never heard my voice. And I had absolutely no idea what to do with that. I could have walked into headquarters and taken the corner office on the top floor. And the board would have shuffled and grumbled and made room, but I kept hearing my father in that truck cab. You understand a company by sitting where the work happens. I didn't know this company. I knew the version of it I'd grown up inside, the Halloran version, the one that didn't exist anymore. I didn't know the Cardinal version. I didn't know whether it was still the kind of place my dad would have recognized, or whether it had become something he'd be ashamed of. And I had a decision in front of me that I couldn't make from the outside, whether to hold the company, reshape it, or sell my stake and let it go. So I did something that the trust's lawyer told me. Repeatedly. was a strange idea. I applied for a job. Not at headquarters. At the Cascade Regional Hub, a 2-story building 300 miles from the executive floor, where no one would know my face, and the founding story was ancient history nobody told anymore. I applied under my own name, Naomi Halloran, because changing it felt like a lie I didn't want to live inside, and because, frankly, I assumed someone would notice, and the whole thing would unravel in a week. Nobody noticed. That's the part people don't believe. But think about it. The name had been off the trucks for 15 years. The company had thousands of employees. Halloran isn't a rare name, and the handful of people who knew the trust existed, the CEO, 2 board members, the trust's council, were on a different planet from a regional analytics desk. The hiring manager at the Cascade Hub saw a candidate with a strong resume in operations data and a quiet manner, and she hired me to crunch route efficiency numbers for $41,000 a year. I signed the offer with a hand that was shaking, half from grief and half from the strangest feeling I've ever had, the feeling of becoming invisible on purpose. For almost 2 years, I was Naomi from analytics. I learned the company from the inside, the way my father wanted. I learned which terminals were quietly losing money, and which managers were quietly miracle workers. I learned that the drivers still got treated like numbers, and the warehouse crews still got their overtime shorted. And I learned that some of the people the company valued least were the ones holding the whole machine together. I learned all of it from a gray cubicle, on $41,000 a year, while a trust with my name on it sat behind the curtain. And I learned, very quickly, exactly who Brett Mason was. Brett was the regional director, my boss's boss, the highest-ranking person in the Cascade building. 41 years old, expensive watch, the kind of man who'd memorized everyone's name above him and none of the names below. He had a particular talent. He could make you feel like the most important person in the world for exactly as long as you were useful to him, and the instant you weren't, you stopped existing. I watched him do it to a warehouse supervisor named Doug, who'd given the company 19 years and got walked out in a Friday afternoon layoff with a cardboard box, while Brett took credit for the efficiency gains Doug's cut salary represented. I watched him do it to interns, to the receptionist, to a single mother in billing who asked for one flexible afternoon a week and got told that results don't have flex hours. He never did it to me directly, at first, because I was beneath his notice. I was a data person. I made his charts. As far as Brett was concerned, I was furniture that occasionally produced PowerPoint. That was fine with me. Invisible was the whole point. Now, the side job, the thing he held over his head, let me tell you what it actually was. After my father died, I couldn't sleep. You know how grief is. It doesn't keep business hours. I'd be awake at 3 a.m. with my whole body humming, and one of those nights I pulled out an old fountain pen of his and a sheet of paper, and without really deciding to, I started drawing a map. My dad loved maps. The cab of every truck he ever rode in had a folded one in the door pocket, soft at the creases. I drew the coast road we used to take to the terminal. I labeled the rivers in his blocky handwriting that I'd inherited without meaning to, and for the first time in weeks, the humming in my chest went quiet. I kept doing it. Maps, then hand-lettered cards, then little hand-bound journals stitched with waxed thread. I gave them away. Then a friend asked me to make wedding invitations, and paid me, and then her cousin did, and a year and a half later I had a little brand, Foxglove and Ink, with a website, a back room full of a second-hand letterpress I'd bought on credit, and a wait list 3 months long. A design magazine ran a 2-page feature on me. A stationery shop in Portland started carrying my journals. Then 4 more shops in 3 more cities. I was clearing more from Foxglove on the side than Cardinal paid me to sit in that cubicle. I never talked about it at work. It was mine. It was the thing my father's death had handed me that wasn't a burden, the one inheritance that felt like a gift instead of a weight. I wasn't going to lay it out on the break room table for people like Brett to poke at. But people talk. A coworker named Priya, different Priya, I'll get to the HR one, saw a journal on my desk, and loved it, and bought 3 for Christmas gifts, and couldn't stop telling people about the artist in analytics. And it got around. And eventually, it got to Brett. Which brings us to the retreat. Every spring, Cardinal Logistics flew its regional leadership and a handful of high-potential staff out to Timbercrest Lodge, a sprawling old timber and stone place on the edge of a cold blue lake up in the mountains. 3 days of strategy sessions, trust falls nobody wanted, and a great deal of expensive wine. I got invited because my route efficiency model had saved the region almost $2 million the previous quarter, and somebody upstairs decided the analyst behind it should be in the room. I almost didn't go. I am not, by nature, a retreat person. But there was a reason I said yes, and it had nothing to do with trust falls. I'd seen the agenda. Buried in day 2 was a governance session, and on that agenda was a line that made my stomach drop. Ratification. Regional restructuring resolution. I'd heard whispers about it for weeks. Brett had been building a plan he called the Lean Cascade Initiative, and the heart of it was simple. Eliminate the regional analytics team. My team, 11 people, including a junior analyst named Marcus who was supporting a wife on dialysis, outsource the work to a cheaper vendor overseas, and fold the savings into a headline number that would carry Brett straight into a VP seat at headquarters. It was, on a spreadsheet, defensible. It was also wrong. I'd run the real numbers, the ones Brett didn't include, the institutional knowledge we'd lose, the errors the vendor would introduce, the 11 families. The plan made Brett look brilliant for about 18 months, and quietly cost the company more than it saved by year 3. I knew that, because knowing that was literally my job. And here's the thing about that resolution. Because it touched a controlling restructuring of regional assets, the Trust's Council had flagged it months earlier as requiring the consent of the controlling trustee. Me. The Trust's lawyer had been planning to attend the retreat himself to handle the signature discreetly and keep my name out of it, the way we always did. But 3 days before the retreat, his appendix had other plans, and he ended up in a hospital instead of a mountain lodge. So the consent packet got handed off, under seal, to the company's head of people, a sharp, careful woman named Renata Calderon, with instructions to obtain the controlling trustee's signature privately and to disturb no one's understanding of who that trustee was. Renata, it turned out, was the only person at that retreat besides me who knew my last name meant something. She just didn't know yet that the trustee she was looking for and the analyst Brett was about to humiliate were the same person. I didn't know that either. I assumed the lawyer had briefed her fully. He hadn't had time. He'd handed her a sealed folder and a name and passed out from the painkillers. So all the pieces were in the room. They just hadn't found each other yet. The first day was forgettable. Sessions, slides, a man with a headset telling us to embrace disruption. Brett ran most of it, holding court at the front of the room in a quarter zip, calling the executives by their first names and laughing too loud at their jokes. I sat in the back with my team and watched him work the room like a man auditioning for a role he'd already decided was his. He didn't speak to me once that whole first day. The dinner was the evening of day 1, in the lodge's big dining hall, long timber tables, antler chandeliers, a wall of windows holding the last gold light off the lake. The wine had been flowing for an hour by the time it happened. I was at a table near the middle, talking to Marcus about absolutely nothing important, the journal I'd been writing in sitting beside my plate where I'd set it down. I should have put it in my bag. I think about that sometimes. But I didn't, because why would I? And Brett walked past on his way back from the bar, and he saw it. He stopped, he picked it up, and he raised it over his head and turned it for the room to see, and you heard the rest already. The candles, the doilies, the glitter, the warm analyst chair, the laughter, the wine my journal landed in, and me, drying the corner against my napkin, saying the one thing I said. You should be careful what you call small, Brett. I want to be honest with you about how that moment felt, because I think a lot of you have lived inside a version of it. It wasn't the joke that stung. I'd heard worse. It was the delight in it, the way he enjoyed it, the way he scanned the executives' faces to make sure they saw him being clever at my expense, and the way some of them gave him exactly the laugh he was fishing for. There's a specific loneliness in being made small in front of people who outrank you, knowing that defending yourself will only make the moment bigger and the joke better. So you don't. You go quiet. You dry the corner of the journal. You let it pass. What Brett didn't know, what nobody at that table knew, was that the calm on my face wasn't surrender. It was arithmetic. I was doing the thing I'd done in that truck cab at 9 years old. I was sitting where the work happens, feeling the company, and what I felt, watching Brett Mason perform cruelty for applause, was the last piece of a decision I'd been circling for 2 years, finally clicking into place. I'd come to that retreat genuinely unsure whether to hold this company or sell it, whether the thing my father built was worth saving, or whether it had become something I didn't want my name behind. And in that moment, with my grandfather's name sitting in a sealed folder somewhere in that lodge, and a man I'd watched discard 19-year employees holding my journal over his head for laughs, I knew. I wasn't going to sell. I was going to stay, and I was going to fix exactly the thing I was looking at. I just had to get through dessert first. I excused myself before the cheesecake, took my wine-stained journal, and went out onto the wide stone terrace that overlooked the lake. It was cold and clean out there, the kind of mountain cold that resets you. I stood at the rail and let my heart rate come down, and watched the light die on the water, and thought about my dad and his soft, folded maps. That's where Renata found me. I didn't know her well. She was headquarters. I was regional. Our worlds barely touched. But I recognized her, and I'll admit my first thought was that I was about to get a quiet HR word about the incident with Brett, the kind where they ask if you're okay, in a tone that's really asking you not to make it a problem. That's not what happened. She came up beside me at the rail, and she was holding a clear folder with a single sealed document inside, and she had a strange expression, careful, almost apologetic, the expression of someone holding information they're not sure how to put down. "Ms. Halloran," she said, "I'm sorry to do this here. I've been trying to find a private moment all evening." She glanced back at the warm windows of the dining hall. Mr. Okafor's counsel, the trust's counsel, was supposed to handle this. He's in the hospital. He asked me to obtain your consent directly and keep it discreet. I understand you prefer it that way. She paused. I have to confess, when I matched the name on the trust to the name on the regional staff list, I thought it had to be a coincidence. It isn't, is it? It wasn't a question. She'd already done the math. I looked at her for a long moment. 2 years of invisibility. The whole careful architecture of it. And here was the first person inside the company who'd looked at Naomi Halloran on a roster and actually connected it to Halloran & Sons Freight, Estcan 1961. Not a board member. Not the CEO. A people director doing her job carefully, 3 days into an emergency she hadn't asked for. "No," I said. "It isn't a coincidence." She let out a slow breath. "The resolution on tomorrow's agenda. The regional restructuring." She held up the folder. "It requires the controlling trustee's consent to ratify. The board can't move it without your signature." She studied me. "And forgive me, but, given what I just watched happen in there, I don't think you've heard what's actually in this plan." "The Lean Cascade Initiative," I said. "I've heard. I wrote the countermodel nobody wanted." Her eyebrows went up half an inch. "Then you know it eliminates the analytics team." "I know it eliminates my team," I said. 11 people. I know the name of every one of them, and the name of every one of their kids." We stood there in the cold for a second, the two of us, the only people on that mountain who understood what was about to happen. And then Renata Calderon, careful, professional, by-the-book Renata, did something I will be grateful for as long as I live. She didn't try to manage me. She didn't smooth it over. She just asked the honest question. "What do you want to do?" I turned the sealed folder over in my hands. I thought about the way Brett had scanned the room for laughs. I thought about Doug and his cardboard box, and Marcus and his wife on dialysis, and the single mother in billing who couldn't get one flexible afternoon. I thought about my father, who knew every driver's kid's name. "I want to go back inside," I said, "and I'd like you to come with me, with that folder, not opened in a back room, out where the work happens." Renata looked at me for a long moment. Then, very slightly, she smiled. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "Here's what I'd ask you to picture, because this is the part I still can't quite believe I lived." The dining hall, warm and loud, dessert plates and wine glasses, the executives clustered around Brett at the head table while he held court. Brett mid-story, mid-laugh, telling the candle joke a third time for someone who'd missed it, miming holding a journal over his head. And the 2 big doors at the end of the hall opening, and me walking back in, wine-stained journal in one hand, with the head of people half a step behind me, carrying a sealed folder in a clear sleeve. The room didn't go quiet right away. Why would it? I was nobody. I was furniture that produced PowerPoint. A couple of people glanced over, then went back to their cheesecake. I walked up the center of that hall to the head table, and I stopped in front of Brett Mason, and I waited until he noticed me. It took a second. When he did, his face did that thing, that warm for the useful, cold for the rest thing, except it couldn't decide which one I was, a junior analyst interrupting his story, so it just settled on amused contempt. "Naomi," he said, loud, playing to the table, "come back for your diary?" "Don't worry, I didn't read your secrets." A chuckle around him. "Actually, Brett," I said, and I kept my voice exactly level, the same voice I used when a route model wasn't working. "I came back because Renata needs a signature, and I wanted you to see it before I gave it." That confused him just enough to shut him up. Renata stepped forward, and here are the 6 words. She held the folder so the table could see the seal, and she said clearly, to me, but for the whole head table to hear, "Ms. Halloran, your trustee consent, please." I want to describe the silence that followed, but I'm not sure I have the words for it. It started at the head table and moved outward across the room like a cold front, table by table, the laughter dying as the meaning traveled. Halloran. People looked at the red cardinal stitched into the cloth napkins. People looked at the brass plaque by the door that listed the company's history. People looked at me. Brett laughed. It came out wrong. A little high. "Halloran?" he said. "What? Like the trucks? It's a common name." "It's not." He looked at Renata for help and found none. "It's a coincidence." "It isn't," Renata said. The CEO wasn't at that retreat. He rarely came to regional things, but the regional VP of operations, a man named Halverson, who'd been with the company 26 years and had actually known my father, was 3 seats down from Brett. And I watched Halverson's face change as it landed, watched the recognition come up through him like water filling a glass. He set down his fork. He stood up, slowly, the way you stand when you're not sure your legs will hold. "Dan Halloran's girl," he said quietly. "My God, you're Dan's daughter." "Yes, sir," I said. "I am." And Halverson, 26 years, a man who'd ridden in trucks with my grandfather, did the thing that broke the room. He didn't shake my hand. He came around the table and he hugged me, and his voice cracked when he said, "Your dad would be so proud you actually came up through the floor." He always said that's the only way to know a company. And then, into the silence, almost to himself, he'd have hated that name coming off the trucks. I felt my eyes sting, and I let them. But I didn't lose the thread. I turned back to Brett. He had gone gray. Genuinely gray, the color draining out of his face in real time, because Brett Mason was a man who'd built his entire career on the precise calculation of who outranked whom, who to charm, who to discard, and he had just discovered that the woman whose journal he'd dropped in a glass of wine, the woman he'd held up as the room's entertainment, the gluing glitter woman, owned 58% of the company he was trying to climb, that every cruel thing he'd done all day had been a performance staged for the largest shareholder in the building, that he'd been auditioning for a VP seat in front of the one person who could actually grant it, by being his worst self at her expense. "I didn't," he started. "Naomi, It was a joke, the candles thing. That was just, you have a great sense of humor, you know that." "I have a great sense of humor," I repeated, not unkindly. "Funny, 40 minutes ago you weren't sure I could take one." He had nothing. Now, this is the part where, in a lot of stories, the wronged person climbs onto the table and lets the whole room have it. The speech, the takedown, the public destruction. I'd be lying if I said part of me didn't want that. I'd watched Brett enjoy being cruel. There was a version of me that wanted to hand him exactly what he'd handed Doug and the single mother, in billing and a dozen interns, with interest, in front of everyone he'd been trying to impress. But I kept thinking about my father in that truck cab. Anybody can read a spreadsheet about a company. Almost nobody bothers to feel it. My dad never once humiliated a man to feel powerful. He didn't have to. Power that needs an audience to feel real isn't power. It's just noise. And the thing I'd decided out on that cold terrace was that I was going to be the kind of owner my father was. And that started right here, in how I handled the worst person in the room. So I didn't climb on the table. I looked at Renata. "Let's not do the signature here," I said. "Conference room B, in 10 minutes. I'd like the regional leadership and my analytics team both present." I turned to Brett. You too. Then I picked up my journal, the one with the foxglove on the cover, the wine drying brown at one corner, and I tucked it under my arm, and I walked back out of that dining hall the same way I'd walked in 2 years before, quietly, on my own terms, leaving a room full of people to do their own arithmetic. The walk to conference room B was the longest 100 feet of my life, and I have never felt steadier. In that room, with the leadership on one side of the table, and my 11 analysts filing in confused on the other, and Brett standing by the wall like a man waiting for a verdict, I did 3 things. First, I had Renata read the restructuring resolution aloud, the actual one, the Lean Cascade Initiative, so that my team heard, for the first time, in plain language, that a plan to outsource their jobs overseas and end their careers had been 3 days from ratification, and that the only reason it hadn't happened was a lawyer's appendix and a journal, dropped in a glass of wine. I watched it land on Marcus's face. I watched him think about his wife, and dialysis, and the insurance he was about to lose. Then I took the sealed folder from Renata, and I opened it, and in front of all of them, I wrote a single word across the consent line, where my signature was supposed to go. Denied. The controlling trustee does not consent, I said, to the Lean Cascade Initiative. The regional analytics team stays. As it is, as it stands. The institutional knowledge in this room is the most valuable asset the Cascade Hub owns, and I will not let it be deleted to make one quarter's headline number look good for one man's promotion. Marcus put his face in his hands. One of the junior analysts started to cry. I'm not going to pretend I didn't have to look at the ceiling for a second myself. And then the third thing. The Brett thing. I want you to know I didn't fire Brett Mason in that conference room. I thought about it. He deserved it on the merits. Not for the candle joke, that was just a man being small. But for Doug, and the box, and the 19 years, and the single mother, and her one afternoon. He deserved consequences. But firing him on the spot, in front of an audience, to a round of stunned applause, would have made it about me. It would have made it a performance. And I'd just spent the whole evening learning, in real time, that the difference between my father and Brett Mason was that one of them never needed an audience to do the right thing. So instead, I looked at Brett, and I said, very evenly, you spent today deciding who in this building mattered and who didn't. You were wrong about almost all of it, but you were most wrong about the people you couldn't see. Tomorrow morning, you and I are going to sit down with Renata and review every personnel decision you've made in this region for the last 3 years. Every layoff, every denied accommodation, every name you forgot, and you're going to explain each one to me, and to the trust, as if your career depends on it. A pause. Because it does. Brett opened his mouth. Nothing came out. That's not a threat, I added. It's an offer. It's more of a chance than you gave Doug. Use it well. And then I told everyone to go to bed. I know what a lot of you are hoping for, so let me give you the honest aftermath, the way it actually unfolded over the months that followed. The slow version. The true one. Brett came to the review the next morning. He came in expensive and confident, with a folder of justifications, ready to spin 3 years of decisions into a story where he was the hero of efficiency. And then he looked across the table at me, at the largest shareholder in the company, the woman with my grandfather's name, and at Renata with her careful notes, and the spin drained out of him page by page. There's no story you can tell about a cardboard box and a 19-year man that survives being read aloud slowly, in your own words, to the family that built the company. He made it through about 20 minutes before the performance cracked, and what was underneath turned out to be a frightened man who had genuinely never once imagined that the people below him were people who would someday be counted. He resigned 11 days later, not because I forced him out. I genuinely didn't. I'd offered the review and meant it. He resigned because he could feel the floor had changed under him, because a man like Brett can only operate in a building where rank is the only thing that's real, and that building no longer existed. The last thing he said to me, in the doorway of my office at headquarters, yes, I eventually took an office, we'll get there, was, I would have treated you completely differently if I'd known who you were. I know, I said. That's the whole problem, Brett. That's the entire thing. He didn't get it. I don't think he ever will. Doug, the 19-year warehouse supervisor with the cardboard box, I tracked him down. Took my assistant 3 weeks. He was driving for a competitor, making less, his back going out. I called him myself. He thought it was a prank. I offered him his old role back at a real wage, plus the 2 years of seniority the company had stolen from him, plus an apology that I delivered in person, because some apologies don't belong on the phone. He cried in the warehouse break room, and so did I, and then he asked, suspicious, "Wait, Halloran? Like the old?" And I said, "Like the old. Welcome back." Marcus kept his job and his insurance. His wife got her transplant 14 months later. He sends me a photo every year on the anniversary. I keep them in a foxglove-stamped journal, of course. Renata Calderone is now my chief people officer. The first thing I did when I took my seat was promote the one person in the company who'd looked at a roster, done the careful math, and then asked me the honest question, "What do you want to do?" Instead of trying to manage me into the easy answer. You want to know who to trust with a company. Watch who's careful when they think no one important is looking. And the trucks. Halverson and I drove out to the central terminal together a few months after the retreat. The old terminal, where my dad took me at 9. The whole leadership team thought I'd called the meeting to discuss the rebrand budget for the new trailer fleet. I had. We pulled up the design mock-ups, the sleek red Cardinal, and everyone nodded along, and then I clicked to the next slide. It was a photo, a single second-hand rig from 1961, two-tone, with my grandfather's name hand-painted on the door. "We're keeping the Cardinal," I said, "but it's going to fly under a name. The name's coming back on the trucks." Halverson stood up again, the way he had at dinner, and this time he didn't try to hide that he was crying. As for Foxglove and Ink, the little side job, the candles, the doilies, the glitter, I still run it. I never shut it down, and I never will. It's the thing my father's death handed me that wasn't a weight, and it's the proof I keep on my desk that a quiet thing can be the realest thing in the room. There's a journal on my desk at headquarters now, Foxglove stamped on the cover, one corner still faintly stained brown from a glass of wine at a mountain lodge. I kept that one. I didn't replace it. Every time someone important sits across from me and gets a little too sure they've got the whole room figured out, I look at that stain, and I remember the most useful thing I ever learned. You should be careful what you call small. So here's what I'd leave you with. For 2 years, I let an entire company believe I was nobody, and the most important thing I learned wasn't about logistics or trusts or ownership stakes. It was about people. It was that you find out exactly who someone is by watching how they treat the person they're certain can do nothing for them. Brett treated me like furniture because he was sure I was furniture. Renata treated me like a person before she had any idea I was anyone. Doug, Marcus, Halverson, every single one of them showed me who they were, before they knew my last name meant anything, and when the name finally landed in that dining hall, it didn't change a thing about who any of them had already shown themselves to be. It just turned the lights on. The name on the trucks matters, but the name was never the point. The point was the woman who went quiet at that dinner table and dried the corner of her journal, and the 11 people whose jobs she walked back into that room to save. If you've ever been the quiet one, underestimated by someone who never bothered to ask who you were, tell me about it in the comments. I read them, and if this story reminded you that your worth was never something other people got to hand you or take away, share it with somebody who needs the reminder tonight. I'm Naomi Halloran. The name's back on the trucks, and I'll see you in the next one.